What's happening, everybody? So I get a lot of questions about camshafts. In particular, guys will hit me up in the messages or they'll ask a question in the live show about a stage cam. For example, a stage 1 or 2 or a stage 3 cam, max effort, whatever the case is. But most of the time, guys don't realize what that actually means. To them, the bigger the number in terms of stage just means the more the power, the more radical that cam is going to be. But you got to kind of understand really what that means so that you can pair the right camshaft with your build. Now, primarily, I'm going to be talking about fuel-injected modern V8s, like an LSX, whatever that may be, modern Hemis. Those engines are going to be a little bit different with what the specifications may look like than, say, for example, an old 350 Chevrolet, 302 Ford, or 340 Mopar. And the reason for that is just because there's some more parts that you may have to buy, or there are stock parts that necessarily won't work with a stage type cam. So let's get into this. A stage 1 cam. Guys, if I'm going to boil down what a stage 1 cam is to its just absolute basic ingredient, it is a stock plus replacement. In other words, let's say, for example, you've got to freshen up an engine. There's no way around it. You're going to be either freshening up an engine for a more or less stock rebuild. A stage 1 cam just might fit the bill. If you've got an LS or a modern Hemi, it's a cam that is not much more aggressive than stock. Say for around 215 degrees on the intake side, maybe 223, 225 on the exhaust. It's a cam that's not going to have a real tight lobe separation angle. Most modern cams have lobe separation angles in the 117 to 121 degree range. Stage 1 cam, about the tightest you're going to see a lot of those stage 1s is around 115 degrees. It's a cam which will work just fine in most cases with stock cylinder heads, stock valve springs, stock push rods, stock lifters. No outside aftermarket parts will be necessary, and best yet, it works with the stock intake manifold and it works within the RPM range of that stock intake manifold. Most of the time with stage 1 grinds, guys are just wanting to put something into a car as a cruiser. Could be a motor swap, kind of a modern engine swap into an older car. Again, you're looking for a cruiser, probably not even putting long tube headers on this thing. You're just wanting to put a slight bump in power, maybe somewhere in the 20-ish horsepower range. You're not looking for too much of a bump, but you do want to add a little bit of flavor to this thing. Works just fine with stock torque converter, basically your general cruiser type intake manifold. I mean, a camshaft that works with a stock intake manifold that will probably not see the drag strip. Now, if we're talking about an old school V8, again, the 302, 350 type of an engine, this is going to be a cam that does basically all of that same stuff, save for the fact that you probably would want to upgrade the valve springs. It would work within the confines of a stock set of cylinder heads. Kind of ends the discussion on the stage 1 right there. Now, a stage 2, a little bit different. Okay, stage 2 can mean a couple of different things for folks, but typically this is what it means. It is a significant performance enhancement over what you would consider to be a stage 1 or stock camshaft. You're looking for something that is not going to build the best bottom end torque the way that a stage 1 would, because again, it's geared more towards a stock car down there in stage 1. Now we're talking about a more performance oriented street strip type of a camshaft. But the thing is that can mean different things to different people. So for the LS and Hemi crowd, what this would typically mean is a camshaft that would be somewhere in the 220 on the intake side in terms of duration, somewhere around 227, 229 on the exhaust side. Some cam manufacturers like odd, some cam manufacturers like even numbers, but that would kind of give you an idea for what it's going to look like. Lobe separation angle on these cams is typically going to be a little bit tighter though, because of the wider duration. you're getting a little bit more RPM. They're going to tighten up the lobe separation angle to make it a bit more mid-range happy and still allow it to make peak power, typically somewhere around 6,000-ish RPM. Now, this is going to be a scenario, though, where your, say, 114 degree lobe separation angle, as opposed to, say, 115, is going to come into play with idle quality. At this point, that nice, fairly subtle idle quality that you had with a stage 1, it's going to be a little bit more cammy sounding with a stage 2. It's typically not going to be overwhelming, and it'll typically work with a stock torque converter. Although this is about the time where guys start thinking about putting a different converter in the car if they're spending more time on the drag strip than they are on the street. But either way you go, it will still work with the stock torque converter, provided that certain tuning parameters are looked into. A stage 2 will require you to have long tube headers for scavenging, and you will probably not need to get a different intake manifold. It's typically just how it works out with these things for the modern engines. Typical bump in power, you can see about 10% out of these things with no real worries about being off the mark in terms of a number. Now, in terms of old school cars, at stage 2, once you start really ramping into more of a street strip type cam, you're going to be replacing intake manifolds, different carburetors. It will absolutely have different cylinder heads on the thing. It's going to be part of a total package. And so anything else for the old school carbureted stuff is going to fall into that heads, cam, intake, carburetor package. And so really the conversation now has to end with the old school stuff, because anything from there is just going to be a complete tear down rebuild type of a situation. So that's where the stage 2 basically ends with the old school stuff. But with the new school stuff, again, this is where most guys wind up, in that 220X but less than 224 and 230X but less than 236 on the exhaust side is a typical grind. And intake center line is going to be somewhere around 109-ish, usually on those cams, whether it's an LS or a Hemi. With the lobe separation angle, again, about as tight as you're going to see, maybe 112 for some of those, but typically to work nice and to play nice on the street, which again, most guys are still driving these things on the street, is going to be really no more than 114 degrees, but typically no less than about 112, right around in that range. Now, what is a stage 3 camshaft? This is where things get a little bit, well, the shades of gray really start to ramp up. A stage 3 camshaft, the way that I've always seen them, is going to require not only a significantly higher level skill set when it comes to tuning, because tuning them is going to be a little bit more demanding, but a stage 3 is going to completely change the complexion of that engine, in that you're going to need, aside from long tube headers, which should be just kind of come without question, but a different torque converter, because you're going to need a looser torque converter, and you're going to probably be using a different intake manifold. The idea with a stage 3 is to try to capture top end horsepower. So where a stage 1 is kind of a stock rebuild, fun, just good tip in torque, you tip into the throttle and it has a good push. Stage 2 is going to be a good all-around cam, something good for the street and for the drag strip, something that can pretty much do burnouts for distance, but not necessarily the fastest thing on the street, but probably the most entertaining, at least in most scenarios. Stage 3 is a purpose-built situation. You're changing the intake manifold for shorter runners to try to get as much high RPM out of this thing. You are probably now looking into potentially ported cylinder heads, significantly better springs. By the way, stage 2 will need aftermarket springs most of the time, as well as aftermarket push rods. Didn't want to forget to mention that. The same would apply for stage 3. However, more care is going to have to be taken when you're selecting these springs. You're going to have to make sure you've got plenty of seat pressure to be able to manage that RPM that you're going to be running. So again, stage 3, a bit more race oriented. In fact, I would go so far as to say that a stage 3 for an LS, most of the LS, this isn't like a blanket statement, but for the LS crowd or for the Hemis, you're looking at an intake duration in the mid 230s and exhaust somewhere in the mid 240s. Now, lobe separation angles. This is a scenario where you're probably still going to be around 110 to 113, but it is going to be incredibly choppy. In fact, it can be so choppy that a lot of guys that get stage 3s end up regretting it. They try to put that race cam, which it really is, on the street, but it doesn't really play nice. And so a stage 2 would still work fine with stock heads. A stage 3, if you're going stage 3, I would probably suggest at least having the heads reworked, possibly ported to take advantage of all this extra high lift and a lot of duration that you're going to be running with. In other words, it's not just the cam that's going to be costing you money, it's the intake manifold, the torque converter, the port work, etc. You can get the idea how this can get real expensive real quick. So, what happens after that? Well, that's going to be a full race setup, maybe a custom grind full race setup. This is a situation where there are no stops being taken and this is a full race appliance. And so the specifications would be for whatever it is that you are, well, what your goals are really for what you're going to be racing the thing in. So I wanted to put this video together just to kind of go through what it means and what these stages mean so that it might help somebody when they're thinking about, well, is a stage 1 really right for me? Well, it might not be. You might be looking for something more aggressive. Somebody may be talking about a stage 3 because they want all the sauce, some quote unquote max effort cam, only to get the cam and find out that it doesn't play nice with the stock intake manifold. The car is super flat down low. It's a pig to drive around in traffic, and it's got so much rasp, but you can't do anything with the RPM because you don't have the right components to work with. Best scenario is to always work with whoever is grinding your cam. Be very honest with them for what your goals are. Have a plan in place and put a cam together that fits the exact needs for what you are looking for your car. See, this is the thing, whether it's a stage 1, stage 2, 3, race, whatever, this is not the time to try to play keeping up with the Joneses. And this is where I've seen a lot of guys go completely too big with a camshaft only to be let down by the fact that either it doesn't make as much power as they thought it was going to make, the driving experience was much more lackluster unless they are at wide open RPM or wide open throttle at high RPM at over 5,500 RPM. There's a lot of things that can come together to conspire to ruin a build and to take all the wind out of your sails just by trying to, again, keep up with the Joneses and put too big of a camshaft, especially in some of these modern cars with great flowing cylinder heads. You don't need that much camshaft to build 530, 550 horsepower at the flywheel. But you can have too much on the street and that'll make it feel like it's only making 300. So with that, guys, post up your comments. Let me know what you think. Let me know what kind of build you're working on and what kind of cam you decided to go with. And that's a wrap. Y'all have a great one.